This is going to be our final lecture on World War II, and we concluded last time with the victory in Europe, or VE Day, and today we're going to be talking about the victory in the Pacific and what the United States did to win that war. In order to do that, of course, we do need to move backwards in time a little bit, back to approximately 1942, which is actually the last place in our lectures that we've talked about, although we have talked further in our in-class discussions about the Pacific War, and we'll go all the way from 1942 to 1945. Now, you'll remember that after the Japanese surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, the United States had to rethink their naval strategy since battleships really weren't an option anymore. Now, that being said, by the way, the United States was in possession of the most battleships in the entire world by the end of the war. So it would be incorrect to say that the United States did not have the capability of using battleships during World War II, although the first battleship didn't really roll off of the production dry docks until 1943. But because of this initial deficit of battleships, the loss of the 10 battleships at Pearl Harbor that needed to be rebuilt and refloated, the United States was forced to shift its attention to its aircraft carriers instead. And of course, this is incredibly beneficial for us, because aircraft carriers turned out to be the most powerful piece of naval hardware that was available. And of course, the United States and Japan both thought that aircraft carriers were important to their naval war, but how important they were going to be, I think, was unknown to everyone. That being said, the aircraft carriers would go on to fight in a number of important battles, two of which we've already talked about, the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, which is oftentimes called the period of the miracle in the Pacific, specifically ending with the Battle of Midway and the reduction of the Japanese air carriers to basically nothing, two damaged carriers that could not launch any planes versus two completely intact American carriers, which could then spearhead several American advances in the Pacific. Now, I wish we had time, and normally in a normal year we would, to talk about all of the important battles that would then occur for the American troops, especially American ground troops, as they began to be involved in the Pacific Campaign. We could talk about Guadalcanal, which was the first real area that the United States sought to control and prevent the Japanese from taking. Guadalcanal was a campaign that lasted almost 9 months and involved naval, air, and ground engagements, and a really interesting combination. However, Guadalcanal is interesting and important for us as historians thinking about the Pacific War because it represented the moment where the United States Command realized that attacking the Japanese in conventional means was probably going to be ineffective. The attitudes of the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal and the attitudes of the Japanese soldiers that were being engaged with on Papua New Guinea with American and Australian troops was starting to be noticed by the American High Command, and the American generals and the Australian and British generals realized that fighting for every island that the Japanese had taken would not only be incredibly costly, but incredibly time-consuming. In fact, General MacArthur issued a statement to Roosevelt, and MacArthur, by the way, was always a very optimistic general. He thought he could beat people sometimes easier than they could actually be beaten. His most favorable estimate was that taking every island occupied by the Japanese would not allow the United States to reach Japan until 1949 at the earliest, and more likely not till 1951 by using less hopeful measures. So to take every island from the Japanese would take an extremely long time. And remember, these estimates are being put out in late 1942. So even MacArthur is admitting that it would take us 7 years of fighting to drive the Japanese out of all the locations we need to drive them out of. And the casualties incurred by the Americans and the British and the Australians would be massive and much higher than the same casualties that any nation was taking other than the Russians were taking in the Western Front. But what MacArthur and many other American leaders realized is that there is no reason to have to take every island taken by the Japanese. In fact, as long as you can destroy the Japanese air and naval power, the Japanese ground forces can be completely ignored. And this is going to lead the United States to take part in a campaign called the Island Hopping Campaign. And that name kind of brings up, at least in my mind, kind of an idea of a childhood game. But in some ways it is. It's kind of like playing hopscotch, But you don't jump on every square. I know in some renditions of hopscotch you jump on every square, but just imagine jumping and skipping squares. And that's effectively what the United States was doing. The reason that it was even taking islands at all is it needed to be able to dock its ships, land its planes, resupply. And so effectively what the United States decided to do was only take islands that were important for that purposes. And so dozens of islands occupied by the Japanese, where the Japanese had dug in bunkers and had machine gun nests and had all of these defensive fortifications in place, were never attacked by the United States, or were attacked only long enough to bomb the airstrip and blow it up to prevent any Japanese planes from using it. And what many of these Japanese soldiers then experienced was literally 3 to 5 years of sitting on an island with nothing to do. You can't get off, you can't get on a boat, you can't fly out, the airplanes are gone, and you're just sitting there waiting for an attack that never comes. That being said, the islands that the Americans did seek to take were islands that were oftentimes very hard fought for. The Japanese and the Americans had almost a racial hatred that developed between the two of them. And in fact, the United States can't really hold its head up in this area because the United States interred Japanese Americans in camps, ostensibly for their protection and to keep Japanese spies from having an easy time spying in American industry. But really, this was because of concerns that all Japanese people had some loyalty to Japan. And the warfare between the Japanese and the Americans was very, very strong. In fact, there are reports from the Japanese side that Japanese soldiers were being told all of these horrendous stories about the Americans, that the Americans would skin them alive, that the Americans would eat them. And of course, the Americans responded in kind. They had stories about the Japanese torturing their prisoners, driving bamboo shoots underneath people's fingernails to torture them, and different things like that. And by the way, there was no truth to the cannibalism or the skinning alive thing, but certainly Japanese prisoners were not well treated by Americans. Certainly German prisoners enjoyed a much better treatment by Americans. And American prisoners taken by the Japanese endured absolutely horrific treatment. And I don't think all of that was racial prejudice. Some of it certainly was, but Japan also had much more limited resources than even Germany did during World War II. So many of the American captives that are mistreated not necessarily because of malice, but because Japan simply didn't have enough food. It didn't even have enough food for its own people, let alone soldiers. So many American soldiers experienced very bad situations, and very few Japanese soldiers actually surrendered. There was this idea in Japan not only that the Americans were bad, but to surrender would not only dishonor you, but it would dishonor your family and your country. And so the Japanese had a vested interest in fighting on until basically the last possible moment. And we have multiple stories of Japanese soldiers coming out to surrender with grenades underneath their clothes, and they'll pull the pins on the grenades and try and blow up as many Americans as they can on their way out, trying to prevent themselves from dishonoring their family and even in their last breath serving their country. Now, the problem with this is that means that the Americans really are forced to kill almost every Japanese soldier on each island because if they won't surrender, they have to be contained, they have to be dealt with one way or the other, and this leads to some absolutely barbaric combats between the Americans and the Japanese, and it requires the Americans to use technologies that we really would have preferred not to use. For example, flamethrower crews would be called up to go through Japanese bunkers and to light the bunker on fire because the Japanese would hide and they would come out at night and they would attempt to kill Americans. Even without weapons, they would sharpen sticks, they would grab knives and swords, and they would attempt to kill Americans in the evening time. And so American crews were forced to go from bunker to bunker, dugout to dugout, and clear the Japanese. And oftentimes we have casualty rates among the Japanese, and actually not even casualty rates, kill rates among the Japanese above 90%. So if there were 10,000 Japanese on the island, more than 9,000 of them would die. And that is absolutely extraordinary. That is very unusual for combat. I know it, as modern American observers, it's like, well, doesn't the loser usually lose most of his guys? Yes, he does, but oftentimes many of those men are wounded and survive, or many of those men are captured. There's just an enormous percentage of Japanese soldiers who are killed in these battles, and a large number of Americans too. The Americans always came out of these battles doing much better than the Japanese, but still the fact fact that the Japanese fought on for so long and were willing to kill Americans basically to their last breath meant that Allied casualties were higher than they would have been had the Japanese surrendered faster as well. So we have bodies racking up on both sides. More Japanese, but certainly an appreciable number of Allies as well. The Japanese Imperial Navy, after the Battle of Midway, was already on its back foot, and in a number of engagements, the Americans continued to defeat the Japanese and win battles. We have a number of situations where the Japanese were simply outgunned by the Americans, and as the war continued, the American aircraft carriers proved to be more and more deadly threats, especially as their air crews became more and more experienced. Again, I mentioned in the talking about Pearl Harbor and the Miracle in the Pacific that the Japanese began the war with highly experienced pilots. Many of their pilots had flown combat missions in China, and contrast that to the American pilots who had just received their flight training and had never fought any enemies in combat, and you can see the experiential difference. But again, because of the Battle of Midway and the almost complete destruction of the experienced Japanese naval pilots, because there was nowhere for them to land after the battle, we have an increasingly experienced American Air Corps, and we have an increasingly new and fresh, inexperienced Japanese Air Corps. And in addition to this, the United States was very kind to their pilots. They transferred pilots out of active duty on a regular basis. Now, of course, those pilots could request to stay in fighting in the war, and some of our highest accomplishment aces, fighter pilots who shot down other fighter pilots, and long-range bomber crews actually requested to stay in the war and not be put on training duty like many of the others were. So it was possible for some American flyers to fly the entire war, but many Americans were transferred back to the States where they would train new pilots, and those pilots would then come in with a body of experience before they'd even hit combat. And so the American pilots, on average, were very fresh. Flying flight missions is a very stressful and focus-intensive activity. And so you want your pilots not to have to fly too many so they can be focused and alert and ready to go on each mission. And the Americans had enough pilots that was easily doable for them. Whereas the Japanese were literally throwing pilots into the meat grinder. They were losing so many pilots and so many planes that the average Japanese soldier, or Japanese pilot, in 1943 had less than 20 hours of flying experience. By 1944, the average Japanese pilot had only 5 hours of flying experience. And by 1945, the average Japanese soldier had not flown an actual plane till he was put in the cockpit of his plane. And so we have a increasing experience level for the Americans, which allows them to perform better, survive missions better, shoot down more Japanese planes. We have a decreasing experience level for the Japanese pilots. Now, that's not to say the Japanese pilots weren't brave. That's not to say that the Japanese pilots never shot down American pilots. It certainly happened. But the experience level of the two air forces was strongly favored in the Americans' side by the end of the war. Another famous thing that the Japanese began to do as the war dragged on, especially in 1944 and 1945, is to begin using planes as suicide attacks in kamikaze raids. Many people think that kamikaze simply means to crash your plane into an enemy ship when you've run out of ammunition, and that is not actually what the kamikaze is. That is certainly a tactic that is used, but actually there were American pilots who actually did similar things. Their planes were damaged. They realized they wouldn't make it back to their aircraft carrier, and so they attempted to ram the enemy ship with their plane. And so that's not what kamikaze is all about. Some pilots have chosen to make that action when they're out of other options. The kamikazes were actually specifically intended as suicide plane bombers, and the kamikaze planes that they flew were actually specially modified with explosives in the main body of the plane itself. What was quickly realized is that modern aircraft carriers and battleships could pretty easily shrug off a plane impact. Don't get me wrong, it can do some damage, gum up the works on the top deck, perhaps take the ship out of active combat, but it has a very low chance of actually sinking a battleship or an aircraft carrier. They're simply too large. And so the Japanese innovated by adding explosives to the planes themselves. The problem is explosives tend to be heavy, so many of these kamikaze planes had extremely light armament, if they had any armament at all. So many of these pilots who committed kamikaze attacks on U.S. warships, did not go into the battle with something else to do. Their only job was to fly their plane into the American ships. And again, this, I think, gives us a good picture of the Japanese attitude towards the war. The Japanese were unrelenting. They were willing to fight almost to the death and almost to a man. So every Japanese soldier seemed to be willing to fight until he could not fight anymore, and he would force the Americans to kill him before he would lay down his weapons. And that obviously was concerning to the Americans because they're thinking about the end of the war. How are you going to end a war with a people that seems intent on fighting till the last man, woman, and child is dead? And there were almost 100 million Japanese citizens in 1944 and 1945. How are you going to kill 100 million people? Or, if you use the casualty rates from the Island Campaign, how are you going to kill 90 million Japanese people before the last 10 million Japanese people submit? This is just ridiculous and would be incredibly costly, not only to America's soldiers, but it would be costly in terms of the ethics of war. Is this really justified? Can we really kill all of them? Well, this problem begins to bother U.S. officials more and more as the war drags on. As the island hopping campaign continues, more of the Japanese Navy and Air Force is destroyed. The last major fleet battle is the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is one of the largest naval engagements in all of history. And at the end of the battle, despite several U.S. losses, the Japanese fleet was really eliminated as a major threat to the United States. Now, there's a number of reasons that the Japanese Navy began to fail during the war, one of which was they really struggled to replace losses. The American factories and dry docks could produce new airplanes and new ships at an unprecedented rate. In fact, by the end of the war, there were more U.S. warships than there were in the rest of the world combined, and I believe that was by a factor of 3. So there was 3 times as many U.S. warships as there were of any other nation's warships combined, and the Japanese simply could not keep up with this. Another problem were resource shortages. Again, we've talked about this in the inciting incidents of World War II. The Japanese simply did not have access to good resources. Oil was limited. In fact, by 1945, the Japanese Admiralty estimated that they would run out of oil in early 1946. It didn't get to that point, but they were close on oil, and they already had to conserve it in certain important ways. They were also running out of rubber. Despite the fact that they'd taken Indochina, the supply routes between Indochina and Japan had been heavily influenced by American activities, especially in the Philippines, and so getting rubber back to Japan itself was difficult, and so many tanks, planes, and ships were starting to have physical problems because they could not get the replacement parts that they needed. In addition to this, Japanese troops had been too widely dispersed, and so it was actually difficult for Japan to produce enough manpower to man the ships and the planes anymore, because Japanese forces were spread out all across the Pacific. There were major Japanese forces in the Philippines and huge numbers of Japanese soldiers in China, and both of those forces were heavily under fire. The Americans had landed in the Philippines in late 1944 and were pushing the Japanese back towards their initial incursion points, fulfilling General MacArthur's promise that he will return. And there's this very famous picture of General MacArthur splashing through the waves and returning to the Philippines. The Japanese forces in China were being heavily pressed by Chinese forces, both communist and nationalist. The nationalists were being supplied by the United States and Great Britain, and the communists were being supplied by the Soviet Union. So the Japanese had their forces very, very spread, and all of those forces were beginning to be held down. And so the Japanese Navy simply couldn't replace physical human losses. It didn't have enough trained men to put boats back in the water, and it didn't have enough men, period, to train up people to get back into the water. And so Japan was simply, from a military perspective, falling apart by 1945. But again, the issue is the indomitable Japanese spirit. There was a concern that every Japanese person that could hold a gun was going to be waiting for the Americans to land and would fight tooth and nail until every single one of them was dead. I mean, this was a real concern. It seems silly now because we know that the Japanese did surrender after the thing that we're going to talk about next. But remember, in 1944, that was unknown. How is the war going to end? We don't know. Well, the United States does have one option that it's been keeping in its back pocket. In fact, this program, which is generally called the Manhattan Project, which is, of course, the program to build atomic weaponry and to use it in war, was a very tightly guarded secret. In fact, President Roosevelt, kept this information from everyone but Winston Churchill and the British government. In fact, the British government had been working on their own nuclear weapons program, and once the United States entered the war in 1941, every British scientist and piece of British data had moved to the United States. So Britain, in return for that, was given full access and specifications from the Manhattan Project. So Britain and the United States were coordinating and cooperating on atomic weapons. The Soviet Union was not officially told about atomic weapons, although Soviet spies had infiltrated the American scientists and were reporting back to Moscow about the atomic bomb that was going to be put into development by the United States by 1945. The atomic weapon was unknown to Germany, although Germany had its own atomic weapons program that had ultimately failed during the war, and it was also unknown to the Japanese, although again the Japanese had been trying to spy on the Americans to find out their progress on it, but they believed the Americans were years, if not decades, away from building a functional atomic bomb. And I'll go into why they thought that when I talk in class about the Manhattan Project with you. Unfortunately, we just don't have time in this lecture. The Japanese, by the way, had also been working on their own atomic program in Korea, and many people believe that the Japanese had actually come very close to having their own functional warhead that was captured by the Soviet Union. But again, that is a story for another time. We will probably cover that when we talk about the Manhattan Project in person. The atomic bomb was hoped by Roosevelt and then by President Truman to be an option to force the Japanese into a surrender. Now, one of the problems with the atomic program was that it was not known how extensive the bomb's detonation would actually be. In fact, there's an interesting section from Robert Oppenheimer, the lead designer of the atomic weapons program in the United States. He was legitimately concerned that the atomic explosion created by a bomb would never stop, and it's possible that dropping the atomic bomb would end all life on Earth. And of course, that wasn't true. A single atomic bomb cannot end all life on Earth, although a series of bombs, say in the Cold War, if they had actually been fired off, certainly could have done that. But there was a serious concern about how large-scale the bombs would actually be. And so was this a weapon that would destroy half of Japan? Was this a weapon that would destroy a single city, a single military base? There was a lot of uncertainty about the exact effects of the atomic bomb itself. So while military planners and the president was aware that the atomic bomb might be able to be used to cow the Japanese into submission, it was not known the exact limits of the bomb's effectiveness and exactly what the bomb would do. And so in July of 1945, the United States tested its first nuclear bomb in a test called the Trinity test, one of the 3 atomic weapons that was detonated during World War II. This test was done in the middle of the New Mexico desert near Los Alamos, and the explosion was measured and it went well. And now President Truman was informed that he, in fact, had 2 functional atomic weapons that he could use on the Japanese. Now, there were more weapons being built. In fact, by the actual surrender date, I believe there were 2 additional atomic bombs that could have been dropped. And the Los Alamos lab predicted that they could probably get a bomb ready every 2 weeks. And there were contingency plans in place to bomb Japan with an atomic weapon every 2 weeks until they surrendered or it proved impossible to get them to surrender, which Truman had tentatively scheduled for December. So we might have possibly had a situation where Japan was hit with an atomic bomb every 2 weeks from August to December. Fortunately, that did not happen. Truman's plan, Truman's hope, was that the atomic bombs dropping would scare the Japanese into surrendering. The reason for this is the idea that the United States could drop these bombs basically unopposed. It was very easy to drop the bomb because the United States used extremely high altitude bombers that really could not be shot down easily, could not be predicted. And once the bomb was away, that was it. There was nothing the Japanese could do to stop the bomb. So this was effectively unstoppable. And the immense destruction of the weapon just effectively made it a weapon of terror. All right, there were ideas about using the weapon on military targets, but Truman decided against using them on strictly military targets and instead focusing on Japanese war production. And unfortunately, that meant dropping it on cities that had civilian populations. And many people have criticized the U.S. for doing this. However, Truman's reasoning was that the Japanese government had a complete control over the media of Japan, and a large bomb dropped on a military installation might be covered up as simply a routine bombing or a strategic bombing, while a drop on a civilian target would guarantee that the people of Japan understood that the United States had power that they had not formerly known about, and really no nation had the capability of doing this before. And so in August of 1945, Truman ordered the dropping of the first atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. The weapon destroyed the city center, and surprisingly enough, while it did immense devastation from the actual power of the bomb and the radiation, more people died in the ensuing firestorm in the wooden buildings surrounding the epicenter of the blast than did in the actual atomic event. And so these bombs had a 1-2 punch of not only did they literally vaporize several square miles surrounding the epicenter of the detonation, but because most Japanese buildings were made of wood, they would light huge fires that would burn for days at a time and cause even more problems. And that smoke would pick up radiation and bathe the surrounding areas in radiation. And this just caused significant problems. The Japanese government maintained radio silence after the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki, and so President Truman authorized a second bomb to be dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Both Nagasaki and Hiroshima were important industrial centers. They certainly did have a role in production of fighter planes and weapons for the war, but again, the size of these bombs simply meant that dropping them on a specific military target was impossible. If you dropped them on that military target, you vaporized everything else around it. And the same thing happens in Hiroshima. And again, more people died at Hiroshima as a result of the firestorms than did of the initial detonation. So again, there's just this 1-2 punch of destruction. Both Nagasaki and Hiroshima are almost completely destroyed by these weapons. Again, not necessarily because everybody in the city was vaporized, but the city was lit on fire, and that burned down a vast majority of it afterwards. The Japanese government, upon receiving word of a second atomic bomb, sprang into action. Specifically, the military junta that had been controlling Japan was kind of pushed out of power, and the emperor himself was asked his opinion on what to do, and he elected to surrender to the United States. In fact, there was only one condition of the surrender of Japan, and that was for the emperor to stay as the monarch. And in fact, many people do not know this, but Japan is actually a constitutional monarchy to this day. The descendants of that emperor are still the emperors of Japan. Japan has an emperor, and so it is a constitutional monarchy, and many people don't know that because it looks like a democracy, just like the UK, right? Except we're more familiar with the Queen than we are with the Japanese emperor. The Japanese surrendered on the deck of the battleship Missouri in August 14th of 1945, and this officially ended World War II. A couple things of note. Number one, the Soviet Union had declared war on the Japanese only a few days prior and had invaded North Korea, or the Korean Peninsula, as I should say it, but effectively the Soviet Union stopped at what would become North Korea in the future, which should not be a surprise. North Korea is a communist nation. It was set up by Soviet leaders, and that was also a contributing factor to Japan's surrender. Although, personally, many modern historians, again, I think overinflate the Soviet Union's role in the war. I personally think the atomic bombs are what convinced the Japanese to surrender, but certainly the Soviet Union's declaration of war was also a factor that the Japanese had in mind. The Japanese sent out orders for their forces to surrender, and again, the island hopping campaign proved extraordinarily successful because the Americans had effectively defeated a number of Japanese islands that they never substantially attacked. Again, just bombed airstrips to prevent the Japanese from landing planes there. And these Japanese soldiers were forced to surrender at that time. Japanese soldiers in China surrendered. The island of Formosa, or Taiwan as we know it today, is returned to the Japanese. The peninsula of Korea is returned to the native Koreans, although Korea would be very unstable and will lead to the next major war in world history, the Korean War, which we'll talk about next week. And so there are some serious after effects of the Japanese war in the Pacific, but the Americans and their allies had defeated the Japanese. And the next events in world history are going to be a result of that, because the Soviet Union and the United States, in their position as the two preeminent world powers after World War II are going to get into several different disagreements, and that will eventually lead to a period called the Cold War, which lasts from approximately 1947 to 1991. That's where we'll pick up next time.